Every child who has ever had to memorize a Bible verse for Sunday school has memorized this one because it's the shortest verse in the entire book in the English translation everyone grew up with. 2 words, Jesus wept. No setup, no explanation needed. Easiest possible line to get right in front of a room full of adults. It shows up on classroom posters as the fun trivia fact, the shortest verse in the Bible, right next to whatever the longest one is. And because it's been reduced to trivia, almost nobody actually reads what's happening around it. Lazarus, a close friend of Jesus, has been dead 4 days by the time Jesus arrives. His sister Mary meets him, falls at his feet, and says the same accusing sentence her sister Martha already said minutes earlier. "If thou hadst been here, my brother had not died." She is weeping. The crowd of mourners around her is weeping. And John, describing what Jesus does in response, chooses a word he uses nowhere else for no one else in his entire gospel. A word that isn't the word he just used 1 sentence earlier for everyone else's tears in the exact same scene. 2 words in English, a completely different verb in Greek. And the fact that it's different is not an accident of translation. It's the whole point of the sentence, sitting in plain sight in the verse everyone thinks they already know by heart. The standard reading of Jesus wept goes something like this. It's the Bible's proof that Jesus was fully human, that he felt ordinary grief the way anyone at a funeral feels grief. A small, tender, humanizing detail dropped into an otherwise dramatic resurrection story right before the big miracle. Comforting, simple, 2 words, 1 feeling. Move on to Lazarus walking out of the tomb.
That reading isn't wrong exactly. It's just radically incomplete in a way that becomes obvious the moment you notice how carefully John has built the sentences immediately surrounding it. Verse 33 says Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, and in the very same breath that he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Verse 35 is the famous 2 words. Verse 38 says Jesus, again groaning in himself, comes to the tomb. 3 separate emotional beats packed into 6 verses, and the gentlest one, the one everyone memorized, is sitting directly between 2 much stronger words that almost nobody quotes. That word groaned, appearing twice, bracketing the tears on both sides, isn't a soft word in Greek at all. It's borrowed from a verb used elsewhere in ancient Greek for horses snorting, agitated and forceful, closer to indignation or barely restrained anger than to quiet sorrow. Which means the 2-word verse everyone can recite isn't a small, standalone moment of gentle sadness dropped in for humanizing color. It's the calm center of something a lot closer to a storm than to a single tear. And the flattening happens specifically because English readers only ever get handed the quiet middle word isolated on its own verse number, with no indication that it's sitting inside a much rougher emotional sequence on either side. Here's the concrete, countable thing sitting inside these 6 verses that the shortest verse trivia fact completely erases. There are 3 separate Greek words at work across verses 33, 35, and 38. Not 1 Greek word doing all the work, but 3, each with a distinct job arranged in a specific pattern around the most famous of the 3. And one of those 3 words is applied to exactly 1 person, exactly 1 time in the entire New Testament. And it's not the crowd, it's Jesus at this exact tomb and nowhere else the whole book through. If the shortest verse in the Bible turns out to be doing some of the heaviest emotional lifting in the whole chapter, sitting at the quiet center of something a lot closer to a storm than to a single tear, that's exactly the kind of thing worth a like so more people run into the actual scene instead of just the trivia fact. And if there's someone in your life who's ever needed permission to feel more than 1 thing at once, this is worth sending them too.
Lay the passage out in order because the sequence is doing real work.
Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days by the time Jesus arrives. Long enough, Martha points out bluntly a few verses later that decomposition would already be underway. There is no ambiguity in the text about whether he is genuinely dead. Martha meets Jesus first and says, "Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died." Mary arrives shortly after, falls at his feet, and says the identical sentence. The repetition itself is deliberate. 2 sisters independently arriving at the same accusation, grief, and something close to reproach, folded into one line each. Verse 33 is where the first of the 3 words appears. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Weeping here twice in one sentence translates klaiō, the ordinary New Testament verb for weeping, used constantly across all 4 Gospels for exactly this kind of public, audible, often communal mourning. It's the verb used of Rachel weeping for her children in Matthew 2:18, or the widow of Nain grieving her only son in Luke 7:13. Loud, visible, the kind of grief a crowd does together, sometimes with professional mourners hired specifically to amplify it. Nothing unusual about klaiō showing up here. It's exactly the word you'd expect for a house full of grieving neighbors. What's unusual is the word right next to it. He groaned in the spirit and was troubled translates a single Greek verb, embrimaomai, and it's a genuinely strange choice for this moment if all John wanted to convey was sadness. Outside the Gospels, the word's core sense is tied to snorting or growling, used of horses in ancient Greek literature, agitated, almost violent in its physicality, the sound an animal makes when it's straining against something. Inside the Gospels, it shows up a handful of other times, and in every other occurrence, it's translated sternly charged or strictly warned, Jesus using the exact same root when he forcefully instructs someone to keep quiet right after a healing, Mark 1:43 and Matthew 9:30 among them. In every one of those other appearances, the word carries real force behind it, not a gentle request, a stern, almost forceful command. It's a word about forceful, barely restrained intensity, not gentle feeling. Whatever is happening inside Jesus in verse 33, moved with compassion, the softer phrase some translations reach for, is doing real interpretive work to smooth over a word that, left in its rawer sense, sounds much closer to anger or agitation than to tenderness. Some modern translations render it was greatly disturbed or deeply moved, each one a slightly different attempt to carry the word's force into English without it sounding like Jesus was simply irritated, none of them fully satisfying, because English doesn't have a single word that means both profound emotional force and barely restrained at the same time this one Greek verb does.
And here is the piece worth being honest about rather than settling too quickly. Scholars genuinely disagree about what exactly that anger is aimed at. Some read it as anger at death itself, at the wrongness of it, the tyranny of it, standing in front of the specific grave of a specific friend. Others read it as frustration at the unbelief surrounding him, the performative public grief of a crowd that, in verse 37, is already second-guessing him. Could not this man, which opened the eyes of the blind, have caused that even this man should not have died? Still others connect it to what he's about to do, bracing himself before deliberately walking toward a decision that, in John's Gospel, sets in motion the plot to have him killed. The text doesn't resolve which reading is correct, and this video isn't going to pretend it does either. What it does make unmistakable is that groaned in the spirit is not a synonym for felt sad. Then verse 35, Jesus wept. Dakryō, a completely different verb from the klaiō used for Mary and the crowd one sentence earlier,
and from the embrimaomai, used for Jesus himself one sentence before that. Dakryō means something more specific and more restrained than either, to shed tears quietly, without necessarily the wailing or audible lament klaiō carries. It's the only time this exact verb appears anywhere in the New Testament, applied to no one else in no other scene in any of the four Gospels. Whatever else is true about this scene, gentle is not the word that covers all four beats. John had the ordinary word, klaiō, sitting right there, already used twice in the same passage. He could have simply repeated it for Jesus and moved on. He chose not to, twice over, once reaching for the horse snort word, once reaching for a verb he uses nowhere else in the entire gospel.
So here's what these 6 verses are actually built to say once all 3 verbs get tracked instead of collapsed into one generic feeling. The Bible's shortest verse isn't a small, standalone moment of gentle humanizing color inserted for warmth before the miracle. It's the eye of a storm. A single quiet breath of restrained, private tears caught between 2 surges of something closer to fury than sorrow, using 3 distinct Greek words across 5 verses to stage an emotional sequence English flattens into a single soft image. Jesus doesn't arrive at Lazarus's tomb feeling one clean, simple emotion. He arrives carrying something that sounds, in the actual Greek, much closer to controlled anger, at death, at unbelief, at whatever specifically provoked it. And inside that anger, without contradicting it or replacing it, there's a moment of quiet, private, unshared tears, using a word reserved for him and no one else in the whole book. Then the anger returns, unresolved, right up until the tomb is opened. The 2-word verse everyone memorized was never meant to stand alone. It's the calm center of a passage that refuses to let grief be simple. And the fact that the calm center gets its own unique, never-repeated word suggests John wanted readers to notice that even inside real anger, Jesus' private tears were still entirely, specifically his own. The tear root doesn't disappear after John 11. It resurfaces exactly once more, with Jesus explicitly at the center of it. And the second scene it shows up in is the other moment in the Gospels where Jesus is at his most exposed. Hebrews 5:7 describes Gethsemane this way: who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death. Tears there translates dakryō, the noun form of the same root verb used for Jesus' weeping at Lazarus' tomb. 2 scenes, and only 2, in the entire New Testament where tear vocabulary attaches directly and explicitly to Jesus himself. A graveside in Bethany, facing someone else's death, and a garden outside Jerusalem, hours before his own. Both scenes involve him alone or nearly alone, praying or grieving in a way the surrounding crowd, mourners in one case, sleeping disciples in the other, doesn't fully witness or share. Both scenes bracket a decision, whether to call Lazarus out of the tomb, whether to walk toward his own.
The ordinary grief word, klaiō, keeps doing its ordinary job everywhere else in the Gospels without any of this added weight. Rachel weeping for her children, the widow of Nain, the sinful woman in Luke 7 washing Jesus' feet with her tears, using the noun form dakryō there too, in one of the only other places outside Jesus himself where the tear root shows up at all. Paul later describes his own ministry to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20 using dakryō twice, serving the Lord with many tears, and writes to Timothy, remembering Timothy's own tears at their last parting. The tear root travels.
It shows up for ordinary human grief throughout the New Testament, exactly the way you'd expect. But the two Jesus scenes attached to Jesus specifically are the two places in the whole story where he is closest to death, someone else's, and then, not long after, his own. Revelation closes the same vocabulary out at the very end of the book. God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death. Dakryō, again, the same root that named Jesus' own tears at a graveside, promised at the very last page to be wiped away permanently for everyone. Lay the two Jesus scenes side by side, and the parallel gets sharper still. At Lazarus' tomb, he is standing in front of someone else's death, about to reverse it. Lazarus walks out minutes later, alive. In Gethsemane, he is facing his own death, and this time there is no reversal offered. Hebrews goes on to say he was heard in that he feared, and then immediately that though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. One scene ends in resurrection, the other ends in the cross. The tear root shows up at the threshold of both, not because Jesus is uniquely fragile, but because both scenes are the two places in the whole gospel record where the text lets the audience see him fully unguarded, before either outcome has been decided. Here's what this means if you're someone currently sitting with grief that doesn't feel like one clean emotion. If what you actually feel most days is something closer to anger than sadness, or both at once, tangled together in a way that makes you feel like you're grieving wrong. The text doesn't ask Jesus to pick one. It doesn't resolve the embrimaomai into something softer before letting him cry. And it doesn't let the dakryō stay soft for long before the anger returns at the tomb's entrance. Both emotions get to be real simultaneously, without either one canceling the other out or requiring an explanation for why they're both there. If grief and anger have been sitting in you at the same time, grief at what was lost, anger at the wrongness of losing it, the shortest verse in the Bible isn't evidence that you're supposed to have arrived somewhere calmer by now. It's evidence that even here, tears and something close to fury were allowed to sit in the same 6 verses without either one being asked to leave first.
If there's someone in your life grieving right now, who's been quietly ashamed of how angry it's made them, as if anger disqualifies the grief or means they're doing it wrong, this is worth sending them directly. Not because the point needs a bigger audience, but because permission like that is easier to receive from someone who already loves you than to talk yourself into alone. There's a second, smaller thing worth naming, too. Notice that Jesus doesn't grieve on a schedule, and he doesn't grieve in front of an audience the whole time either. He's surrounded by mourners in verse 33, forceful in front of them, and then in the very next breath, weeping in a way the text records but doesn't stage as a public performance. Grief that shows up privately, quietly, after the public reaction has already passed, isn't a delayed or incomplete version of grief. It's simply a different room of the same house. If your own grief hasn't looked like the version other people expected to see, loud where they wanted quiet, quiet where they wanted loud, this passage doesn't ask you to perform it differently for anyone's benefit. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. Verse 33, klaiō, the ordinary word, loud and communal, Mary and the crowd weeping together, the way grief usually sounds from the outside. Verse 33, same breath, embrimaomai, something closer to a horse's agitated snort than to sorrow, aimed at death, at unbelief, at what's about to happen, the text never fully resolving which. Verse 35, dakryō, quiet, private,
reserved for Jesus alone in the entire New Testament, the only word in this whole sequence that belongs to nobody else. Verse 38, embrimaomai again, explicitly marked again, closing the bracket the same way it opened. And underneath all four, one more thread, visible only once you go looking, the same tear root that names Jesus' quiet weeping here resurfaces exactly once more in Gethsemane, hours before his own death. The two moments in the whole story where the man doing the saving is himself the one standing closest to a grave. Picture two waves close together with one narrow, quiet trough between them. And that trough is the verse everyone memorized as a child, the easy one, the shortest one, sitting there the entire time as the calm center of something far rougher than a Sunday school poster ever let on. If you've spent your whole life reciting Jesus wept as the trivia fact shortest verse without ever noticing the two much stronger words bracketing it on either side, that's not a failure of attention. Almost every English translation hands you the quiet middle word in isolation, on its own verse number, with nothing marking that it's sitting inside a rougher sequence. The Greek text never let the grief stay simple. Only the English chapter and verse system did, by accident of formatting rather than intent. If you've ever wondered what this text actually says happens when someone dies, not the comforting version, the actual claim on the page, that's a question this channel sat with directly in an earlier video, and it pairs naturally with this one if you want to keep going after this. If this changed how you read the two words everyone already knew, tell us in the comments which of the three, the loud weeping, the groaning, or the quiet tears, feels closest to where you actually are right now. That's exactly the kind of thing worth talking through together, not settling alone. A like helps more people find the fuller scene instead of just the trivia fact. Subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this kind of verse, the two-word one everyone thinks they already understand. If you're watching this today, here's a word for you. If grief and anger have been living in you at the same time and you weren't sure that was allowed, even he didn't pick just one standing at that grave, and neither do you have to.